Hey everyone, I'm Keeks, and today I've got with me probably my only friend that can rival my knowledge of Star Wars, so say hi, Ben.
Hello, and fun fact, Thrawn knew both Anakin Skywalker and Anakin Skywalker as Darth Vader in the novel Thrawn Alliances. So there's
Well,
my very dry fact for you.
yes, thank you. I appreciate that because I'm sure anyone listening wasn't sure if you're actually a true fan, but now they can confirm that. So today I want to talk about the sequels. I think it's safe to say that they had a mixed reception at best. What do you think, Ben, right? Like, some
Yeah, I
people
would
liked
agree.
it, some people not so much.
It started off pretty strong. Some people had some issues with Seven that I think would become more apparent later, but I think that they were probably on the money with those criticisms at the time, in retrospect.
Yeah, I
But yeah,
think
they
so.
definitely got more divisive as they went on until you get to nine, where I mean, people like it. I mean, I'm sure there's tons of kids that love it, but
Yeah, and I think it can be a good movie. I think they kind of, it felt almost like we missed a movie in between, though, you know?
yeah, yeah. There's a lot missing in connective tissue there, like it should have been too. But we'll get into that.
For sure. So, but whether you loved it or hated it, I think it's pretty likely that these are going to stay in canon, and I don't think they're going to just wipe them out entirely by any means. Doesn't seem like something Disney would do. I think they're just going to let it cool for a while, and then once people have kind of cooled on it, then they'll start to kind of pick it up again and just run with it. What do you think? Do you think they're going to scrap it entirely?
No, I mean, you gotta think about it this way too. I mean, there are probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of kids who saw these movies and they love them.
Yeah,
And
and this
they're
is their
not
first
thinking about
introduction to Star Wars for a lot of
yeah,
those kids, too.
yeah, exactly. They're not thinking about the lore issues or inconsistencies or anything like that. They're just saying, well, this is my first Star Wars movie, so I love it, and I don't want to take that away from them. I don't want to do to those kids what the boomer generation of Star Wars fans did to prequel kids. So, but I would like to discuss, kind of get into the details of kind of what didn't work and maybe even what did work.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure. So instead of rewriting a better sequel trilogy, I think today we can talk about how we can fix some of the plot points and characterizations from the sequels of the characters we know and love, doing our best to not actually change any of the actual physical events that happen in those movies so we can still move forward in the universe with what we already got.
Yeah. So as an example, Luke still lights his lightsaber over Ben, but we might provide additional context to expand on that. But we're not rewriting that scene. That scene isn't being deleted.
Yeah, no, I mean
It's
that.
important. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that's great, and it's gonna lead us right into our first point.
Yeah, it's important really to make a distinction here. A lot of people misuse the term retcon. All a retcon is recontextualizing the events of something that we are already familiar with. As another example of that, in Episode 4, or just Star Wars as it was known when it came out, Darth Vader and Anakin Skywalker are two different people. Episode 5 retcons that so that Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader are the same, and that scene still makes sense. It just recontextualizes Obi-Wan's
Exactly.
motivations in
That's
telling
that's a
that
great
story.
that's a great example.
So a retcon is not a bad thing. It can be done badly, but it is not inherently a bad thing. And like we said before, we don't want to rewrite these. The movies are the movies. We just want to hopefully strengthen them rather than deleting them or completely rewriting them like I've seen some other people do.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're on the right track there. So I think it's very safe to say that the best way Disney can do this is if Luke wakes up on Endor and it was all just a crazy Force vision after they had that huge celebration, right? He had some like death sticks or something and had a weird trip.
Yeah, yeah,
Good. I'm glad we're all in agreement there. But really, Luke's characterization is something I wanted to touch on. So my biggest problem with episode 8 actually was I actually did like the stuff between Rey and Luke. I thought there were some really interesting scenes in there, and I thought it did expand a bit upon Jedi lore. But my problem with Luke's characterization is, from everything you and I know about Luke, he would never give up on anyone or anything. So it felt to me a little off in the sequels when Luke was kind of such a downer and he tried to kill Ben. I think the problem with it is we never saw him in a dark place. Even like all the supplemental material other than the movies we got, Luke was never in a dark place, right? I mean,
yeah.
do you...
I
Go
agree
ahead.
with that. That's the critical issue I think with that. It's not something I felt coming out of the movie. But as with time, and I see people make this argument more and more, I understand it. You got to think like from the perspective of a lot of fans. The last time they saw Luke, he had just saved his father, the second most evil person in the galaxy, from the darkness. And then decades later, he's, has a bad feeling about Ben and ignites his lightsaber out of instinct. I don't know about that. This is an older, wiser Luke. I think the issue is not that he is a hermit or that he kind of abandoned his order or any of that necessarily. It's that they didn't do enough to explain why he was like that. And that probably should have happened in episode 7, if we're being honest. The movie should not have ended with them finding Luke. It should have, throughout the movie, Luke should have been there and we should have been exploring his headspace.
Yeah,
or at least had something in between the movies to give us some more information, because people like to point this out, that being a hermit was George Lucas's idea. So that was always going to happen with the sequels, whether or not George did it or someone else did. Yeah. However, I think what's important is the context of why he was like that.
Yeah, I think even in episode 7, we could have seen him as a hermit and a bit of a downer, and then episode 8 goes into the backstory as to how it got that way. So if it's just me trying to recontextualize this scene, the way I would look at it, and the way I would do it, was reading the book Shadow of the Sith. They go very heavily into these ancient Sith relics that certain Sith Lords have. They kind of bound their souls to these different kinds of objects in order to gain immortality, to live on after death. The people that pick them up are often heavily influenced, becoming very aggressive or even taken over entirely by these Sith relics, because the power of the dark side just overcomes them. Now, Luke is very powerful in the Force, but we know that he's been collecting a lot of these relics, not just Sith relics, but ancient Jedi relics, and even just different Force user relics as well. And he's been doing that for like literally 3 decades now. So I think it's very plausible that even though, none of these things took over his mind and he was able to kind of resist the pull of the dark side of some of these objects, I think over the years of being in close proximity to them, we're just slowly wearing him down, and he gets a lot more cynical and even perhaps slips for a brief second or something, which can explain that moment he saw an evil Force vision of Ben becoming just like Vader. Because, even in the book Shadow of the Sith, he gets a vision that gives him these outcomes of things that don't necessarily need to happen when he's in proximity to these kyber crystals of Darth Exum. So he's clearly prone to seeing these kinds of visions in close proximity to dark side relics and things like that. So I think, to me, that would solve my complaints, because I can see a very easy path that would make him maybe slip up for a second, and then all of a sudden he realizes what's happening, and that's, he puts his lightsaber away, and now, to me, that recontextualizes Luke, because I think it just makes him more of the Luke that we knew, that just got corrupted by kind of a third-party force, not just, over the years he grew cynical because, he didn't like the way Ben was acting or something.
Yeah, and it's not really explained in the movies either. He sort of just looks at Ben and he senses that his heart's been taken by the darkness, but the reason that rings hollow, and I think what he was trying to do was create a parallel with Return of the Jedi, with that moment where Luke decides to go to the light, and he's given that opportunity because Vader then goes and saves him. But the problem is that he has every reason to hate and fear Darth Vader, and he chooses not to anyway. Yeah. Right? He has no reason to react this way to his
at the time, innocent nephew too, right?
Like, he hadn't done anything yet, and I can understand the fear, but he, through his own experience, he saw that it's not too late. He brought him back, and you could say that this is a character flaw, but to me, in Return of the Jedi, it was never presented as a character flaw that he gave in. It was a character triumph that he was able to pull back from it at all. And I feel like they're kind of... There was this parallel that I think was trying to be created, but I don't think they justified it in the story well enough. And I like that way that you're explaining it, in that he basically gets a clouded vision, more or less, from all these dark side relics. And what would be really cool about that also is that his fear of the future acts as a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Correct. And it basically always does in Star Wars, does it not?
Yeah. And that's the thing, is I think that that's also kind of what he was going for by him I mean Ryan Johnson in episode 8, but however they didn't give you enough there. It would be kind of like if Anakin never saw that vision of Padme dying
Yeah.
in that premonition, and then he just did everything he did anyway. He just got like a kind of bad feeling.
Yeah.
We didn't see it.
Correct.
So I think if we saw Luke's vision of Kylo Ren,
it might make a little more sense.
The relics, it'd make more sense, but it would also feel like a good connective tissue between those movies where he's sort of repeating the same mistake that Anakin did, though. I mean, not quite as bad on a personal level, but
he didn't kill billions of living creatures, so I guess
it ties back into that. It's sort of like that sort of speaks to a broader problem I think with the sequels, is that they kind of under-explain everything. And it's very frustrating. Like you can maybe argue that the prequels over-explain.
Yeah, I definitely can see that. I wonder if they were planning on if they said, hey, this is all going to be explained in supplemental material, or if they were trying to explain it and just drop the ball.
Right. Yeah, and that's the thing is whatever material that they do release would need to recontextualize, not just explain. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I think
it's not enough, and I think your suggestion really does fix that. A vision, or even if Ben actually does something observably bad.
Yeah.
And he tries to have a conversation with him and it doesn't go well. That's another way that could work. Just him like walking into his hut, sensing darkness or sensing that his heart's been taken by Snoke or something, and then igniting his
there needs to be more. I need to see something that is going to push literally Luke Skywalker, the most optimistic person in the whole galaxy, to do something that drastic,
Right.
But speaking of Ben here, though, I know Ben falling to the dark side is kind of another point to bring up here. We never really saw why he fell to the dark side. There's a comic book called Rise of Kylo Ren, and in that comic book they show him becoming a Sith and like how he rejected the Jedi ways and everything, but we still didn't get the why. I don't know if you read that or heard that.
Yeah, I did, and I don't think it's ever really been explained, and that might happen maybe in a separate trilogy, kind of like, because we never knew why Vader turned to the dark side in episode 5 and 6.
Yeah.
So I mean, like they have the opportunity to explain that, but
I think it's important to see why he falls to the dark side, though, because in the original trilogy, the focus was on Luke. It wasn't on Vader. So why he fell to the dark side didn't matter so much as he was on the dark side and Luke was our protagonist, right? So it just didn't really matter. We don't really care why Palpatine, fell to the dark side. Was he always that way? Did he have something? It didn't matter because Luke's our protagonist. But in the sequel trilogy, really, Kylo and Rey are both the two main characters, and I feel like you need a reason to kind of follow both of them, which I think they failed a little bit on for Ben particularly.
And Ben is still an interesting character, but I think what separates the way that the Vader was done is we don't see the conflict that Vader's having really until the end of episode 5, and it's very subtle, right?
Yeah.
And then it's not stated at all that he's having conflict really until episode 6, whereas we see Ben having conflict from the jump, so it makes why he turned it all like very confusing, and then it feels like something that begs the question from 7 from the start that they don't explain in any of the movies. He just comes back because we see that he has the pull to the light. He doesn't really want to be doing these things, but he feels like he's doubling down, which is basically Anakin's situation. But I feel like they explained the dialogue of the prequels might have prevented you from emotionally reacting to Anakin's descent into the dark side, if that was something that stopped you. But it was always explained in the movies. Like, it wasn't really ambiguous if you actually just stopped to like think about it. Whereas with Ben, you don't really ever find out why. That's something that you might find out later. And I think episode 7, unlike episode 4, does beg the question of why he fell to the dark side. Whereas episode 4 does not beg the question of why Vader fell to the dark side. Wasn't until Vader got redeemed in 6 that you're like, oh, like, how did he become, like this in the first place? Not until the end of the trilogy does that even ask that question.
So if I have to ask you, like, how would you retcon this? How would you make a compelling reason for Ben?
This is going to vary, and I'm not saying I would hope that like professional writers could come up with something better than I can. But I would make his disillusionment with maybe his father and his parents more obvious, because I think that's sort of been hinted at, that him and Han don't have the best relationship.
Yep.
It sort of seems like
Put
Leia
a little more pressure on the parenting styles. And,
right.
the attachments that he's already formed, right? Because he didn't
Yeah.
go to the Jedi Temple till he was a little bit older than as was tradition in the prequels.
Right. So we know from the novel Bloodline that Ben Fall learns that Darth Vader is Anakin Skywalker at the same time as the galaxy does.
Yep.
So what I think is really important about that and what should be expanded on is that everyone lied to him about this. And then he's going to start questioning why people lied. And people aren't going to be giving him satisfying answers.
Yeah.
Luke wasn't given satisfying answers, but he didn't turn to the dark side. But Ben is not like Luke.
And also, I think it's important that from that same novel, Bloodlines, I believe they talk about how Han Solo's kind of an absentee dad a little bit. He's going on missions a lot and doing runs, so he's not really around very often.
It doesn't have to be like verbatim stated in the movies, but I feel like, you know, that should have been explored more. We should have seen more. They are already going with flashbacks in episode 8, so they should have just done more of that. Just giving us pieces so that we can put it together at least. And then if they want to expand on it, you know, in a separate trilogy, they can. And we could see, you know, the fall of Ben. But I'm not quite as interested in that, knowing where his story ends, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I would fix it by just showing more. Showing his disillusionment with his parents, his disappointment or his anger at the fact that nobody told him Vader and Anakin were the same person, what exactly that means for him, what that meant for Anakin and as a person, why they hid that from him, you know, all that stuff could have been really explored. And that sort of runs into a deeper problem, I think, of the sequels sort of going out of their way to not acknowledge the prequels as much.
Fair.
8 actually not as much, funnily enough, because there are very obvious visual parallels in 8 to Revenge of the Sith and some other Star Wars movies as well. So I think that visual language was making an attempt to be consistent with the first 6 movies, but 7 and 9 definitely feel like it. Like, it's just like we don't see the Force Ghosts at the end of 9; they just talk a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that brings us into our next point too. Of, you know, how come Anakin didn't appear ever as a Force Ghost to Ben?
Yeah, that is really frustrating to me for multiple reasons. And they could very easily explain this, and that's what's annoying about them not explaining it. Is it seems like the person has to be receptive to seeing the Force Ghost in order for them to see them, but you don't know that in the movies, and that's really only something that's like hard confirmed in the comics or the Kenobi series, where
which also just happened, right?
Just happened, yeah, where Qui-Gon tells him, like, yeah, you just weren't ready to see me. That's the only reason you couldn't. So it makes sense, but I think it would have gone a long way to, because you gotta think from Anakin's perspective in this situation. His grandson is taking lessons away from the worst version of himself. I don't think that Anakin as a person, at least as we knew him in the prequels, I'm sure he's changed since his death.
Yeah.
But, or, you know, grown wiser. But
we hope.
I don't think that person would sit there and be like, yeah, I'm okay with this huge, basically, misunderstanding.
See, and I guess here's the thing for me. Let's say that Kylo Ren is all evil and everything, not receptive to see the Force Ghosts of anybody else. 2 things kind of, you know, bother me about this. One, I would think he is receptive because he basically has a shrine to Vader on his ship, always trying to talk to his father, or his grandfather. But let's say, okay, even still, he's still not receptive. I think once he makes that decision to go back to the light side at the end of 9, I think that he has to be receptive there, right? I mean,
he has to be receptive then. So there's no reason we shouldn't have seen him at that point. So that only explains 7 and 8 and, you know, the first half of 9.
Yeah.
What's additionally very strange about that is that Anakin's not somebody who just sits there and lets things happen. And I think that would have been a lesson he would have learned as a spirit. However, I think he would have found a way to do something without, you know, destroying the galaxy in the process, like he did last time.
Yeah.
And it's very weird to me that he wouldn't do anything. It feels incongruous with his character. And I really feel like the only reason he wasn't included was because J.J. Abrams didn't want prequels, or Disney didn't want prequel stuff, because at the time, they were still more contentious than they are now. So, like, I can understand that for a meta reason, but that's a really bad narrative reason to do something like that.
Yeah.
But there's a larger problem with him not appearing in 9, even not trying to help Ben, is the destruction of Palpatine being taken away from him was something that would have needed to be handled really well. And I don't think that it was. In the same way Luke rebuilding the Jedi Order was taken away from him.
Yeah.
it kind of makes Anakin's legacy really depressing and sad, and not in a good way, like where it's sort of bittersweet that he died right when he came back to the light, but in
Yeah.
like a wow, so even his good actions, final action and death. I mean, it doesn't negate the fact that he did a good thing, but thematically, that scene in Return of the Jedi was about Luke saving his father, but it was also about Anakin making the right choice in a
Yeah.
more sub-theme way, conquering his abuser. This Palpatine is a groomer, not in a sexual sense, but
I mean,
in,
we
in
don't
a
know that.
well, we don't, but but yeah, but he definitely groomed Anakin from a young age, and in a lot of ways that was him kind of removing the shackles that he's been placed under his whole life.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
by taking that away from him, you've taken away some of the weight that could have caused, and that could have been mitigated, I think, by handling Palpatine's return better.
Yeah, and in fact, actually, that's my fifth point that I have here. So I'm gonna hold off on answering that, and just quickly, I'm going to touch on my fourth point, because it's not so much a retcon as it is just kind of a path forward that I think Rey should have going forward. Not to change the subject too heavily here, but we know that Ben didn't actually kill all of the Padawan that Luke was training at his temple.
Yes.
So they're out there somewhere, probably. And, knowing how Star Wars works, there are definitely some survivors out there. So I think it's going to be important for Rey to go find these Padawan and kind of reunite them all. And I also think that I don't think Rey should be a master at this point when she finds them. She's a very clear Jedi Knight, I think, at the end of Rise of Skywalker, but she's not a master. And none of the other Padawans are as well. So I think something that could be really interesting to see is basically her gathering the other Padawans. And I don't think this will happen, because if they do something like this, they'll probably say like, oh, she's a master, she's going to train all the other Padawans now. But what I would like is basically all of those Padawans and Rey kind of getting together and sharing their knowledge, because all of the Padawans have, I think, more formal training than Rey does. I think they likely trained with Luke a lot longer than Rey trained with Leia. So they would actually have a decent amount of knowledge to impart on Rey as well. And she has a lot more practical knowledge, and she also has the Book of the Wills. So she's got a little more practical, some more book knowledge and stuff. But I just think that could be a really interesting character development for Rey going forward. And I just kind of wanted to shoehorn that point in there.
No, I think that's important, because it kind of leads into why I think 9 sort of makes Anakin's legacy very sad, because Luke then also fails. So
yeah,
there was a really poetic sense of Luke rectifying his father's mistakes, and also the Jedi as a whole's mistakes, since he was a legacy to darkness, and turn that into something positive. And that's kind of been taken away from him and given to Rey. And I'm not saying this because I don't like Rey as a character. I do like Rey, but I don't think that is as interesting as Luke.
Because it's the son of the person that essentially ruined the galaxy trying to fix it.
Exactly. And he's a legacy to the Jedi that did fail, that had a lot of institutional issues and systemic problems, and contributed to Anakin's fall. And there was a very poetic justice about Luke being the one to fix that, and the fact that he now hasn't is sad in a way that I don't think is satisfying.
Yeah.
So when Rey does rebuild the Jedi in some fashion, I would like to see them using the Ghost a little more liberally, to have Luke have at least somewhat of an active role.
Yeah, I think that would make a lot of sense, and Anakin too, while we're at it.
So. Yeah, Anakin too. I would also like to say that see them kind of retcon that Ben destroyed the Jedi Temple and just destroyed one of many Jedi Temples.
Correct.
So there could be many Padawans scattered throughout the galaxy as legacy to Luke. That could, I think, help massage that too. That's a big retcon that I would do. And that's like the easiest to slide into, because I don't think that there's any language. And
that
even
specifically
in the
says he destroyed every single one out there, and there's definitely no more.
Right,
so,
right.
I mean,
so, like,
if Vader wasn't able to do that when he was on his mission, I think it's safe to say that Ben, in the, how many years was he a Sith? 3, maybe? It wasn't.
I don't know how long, because he didn't fall until he was like 30 almost.
Well, actually, I take that back. I think it was like 6 years. I just researched this. I can't remember what I found, but I believe it was around 6 years. But even still, Vader and Palpatine were going after the Jedi for 20 years almost. So
yes.
if they weren't able to destroy every single one, I hope Ben wouldn't in the half decade that he was.
Oh yeah, and this is a retcon that I would do that I might be the most contentious one because this affects all the movies. Is I would like to see them expand the amount of time between almost every movie except 3 and 4. I would make the Clone Wars I'd probably double the length of that, if not more. Make it like 6 or 7 years. I would make at least 2 or 3 years between every prequel. I don't really like that 8 picks up right after 7. I feel like that really
I thought that
limits
was
the story
big
that they can
detriment.
tell.
Yeah,
because it feels like 8 just sort of treads water and doesn't go anywhere because there's no lapse in time really. And then 9 only takes place a year, which is okay, but I think that's the same amount of time that happened between 5 and 6 as well.
it is.
But I would have liked to see, that's what I'm saying is I would have put 2 years between Empire and Return, put 2 years between each of the sequel movies, and
yeah,
the only one I wouldn't change is 3 and 4 because I think 20 is plenty.
Yeah, and 6 and 7.
I think this would be easy to do. If this is wrong, you definitely correct me. I don't think that the characters' ages are mentioned anywhere outside of supplemental material or timelines at the start of books and stuff. I don't think they're actually stated in the movies.
Correct.
So I feel like you could just sort of age everybody up a few years and not a lot would change, but it would give you more breathing room for the stories.
Yeah.
That probably isn't possible between 7 and 8. I don't think that...
I always thought the Clone Wars was ridiculous how much stuff happened in that 3 years.
I know, I think giving more time would have been good because it's they're going on back to back missions, and then they still have, 3 years is still a long time, but
it is
that is a lot
time.
of you gotta think you're doing hyperspace traveling for a week or two, you're doing a mission, traveling again, mission, going back to Coruscant, going back to the outer, that's going to eat up a lot of time in itself, and I understand that Star Wars has never really been concerned with the logistics of all of that, but I would like to see that time expanded. Maybe not between 7 and 8 because I don't. That might not be possible with the way that the movie is. I don't know if it's stated that they just came from Starkiller Base or not. If they didn't, then I think you could add the time, but if not, then that's probably fine. But I think the biggest retcon is probably the next one.
Yeah. So the last thing I have here for a retcon is, and this gets a lot of crap from other people, it's a very classic meme of somehow Palpatine returned, right? I mean, that's ridiculous, and they still have not really explained it. They threw one line out that said oh, he was a clone somehow, but they still haven't gone into detail as to how basically any of that worked. So I want to kind of fix this. Obviously, Palpatine still has to survive. We're not changing what happened in the movies, but I don't want to undermine Anakin and Luke's actions from Return of the Jedi. So I think the way that I would do this is to have this not be the original Palpatine. So
yeah, because it's never stated as such in the movie, I think you can get away with that.
So I think what would make a lot of sense to me would be Palpatine. We know he was studying to learn how to become immortal. So I think that you could very easily say that he transferred his consciousness into some Sith relic and placed it on an idol in the shrine or whatever while he went back onto his Star Destroyer and everything. And upon his death, he had some contingency plan for the Sith Eternal cultist to take that mask or relic or whatever he has and infuse it into the next clone, whatever clone body this would be. Now, this clone, I think, would be more or less like an echo or a shadow of the original Palpatine and retain some of the original Palpatine's memories and abilities, but not all of them. Plus, he's in a decomposing body.
Yeah, it would be a copy-paste rather than cut and paste.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of a new one. He doesn't have all the stuff, and I think it's very important that this clone would not have the incredible strategic mind of OG Palpatine. I think it's very arguable that the First Order contingency plan was put into motion by the original Palpatine, and it was just kind of part of his contingency plan of things to do. And we have not seen this clone Palpatine truly orchestrate anything near as successful as the original Palpatine, right? He didn't really do anything, not that we know of. You can say he orchestrated the entire First Order and the rise of Snoke and all that stuff, but I think it's just as likely that the original Palpatine had that in a manual somewhere that they were just reading off of. And this new Palpatine, though, has, some dark side power, and he has the consciousness and, intent as original Palpatine, it's not the same Palpatine. And I think Anakin may not have taken Palpatine out 100%, but he still did dismantle the entire Empire, and, Luke as well. And then they replaced Palpatine with a crappy version of Palpatine that the rest of the universe would be able to take on after he was gone. So his efforts were still invaluable to the fate of the galaxy.
Yeah. And it should be stated too that it doesn't change the fact that by Anakin killing Palpatine, they were still able to put the galaxy in a much better position than they would have been otherwise. It doesn't it doesn't undo the narrative weight of that action, but what does get undermined is the thematic and character stuff for Anakin and Luke. I have a couple ideas for how we could retcon Palpatine as well. Is one, I mean, this actually ties back into your Sith relic stuff, and we kind of get into there's a comic from the Vader comics. It's either the 2017 or the 2015 run. I'm not 100% sure, or 2018 run. It's one of the Marvel Vader comic runs where they discover a Sith artifact for the Sith Lord Momin, and it is the essence of the Sith Lord just tied to the helmet, and basically could possess people if the helmet was put on. I think they very easily could have done this if they wanted to say Palpatine survived, but then he would have been bound to
the helmet.
The helmet, or he would have been bound to the location. So let's say, okay, he was able to survive, but he can't leave Exegol. Or he, was put into the clone body, but it's deteriorating.
And I mean, I do think that was kind of what they were going for, right? He needed Rey's body essentially to sustain himself, because nothing else would sustain him, so he couldn't actually leave Exegol, which would make sense as to why she was the key to everything for Palpatine, and getting her there. Otherwise, he was just kind of a dude sitting on a chair in Exegol, but had no real power.
Right. He would have no reach. So that would have been really cool if he was bound to an object. They do explain in the novelization of Rise of Skywalker that he does basically do, I think, the same thing he does in Dark Empire. He pushes his consciousness out to Exegol. To a clone body. So they do explain that in the book, but I feel like you can kind of just ignore the book, to be honest with you.
I mean, in the book Shadow of the Sith, Luke does the same thing. He forces his consciousness onto Exegol and actually has to be saved by Anakin, Force Ghost Anakin, at one point. So it's definitely possible for Force users to do that.
Yeah, and even in 8, I mean, he projects his consciousness to, a different part of the galaxy. In a more physical way. So it's not without the realm of, what the series has showed us. I think the best way would be to tie it to a Sith artifact. That could be what Ben is looking for, which eventually overtakes him, and then they can kind of go from there. That would be getting into more of a rewrite territory, but as far as just explaining how Palpatine came back and the body, I would have just said he's bound to that area, and that he was trying to perform the specific ritual that Momin did to preserve his essence, but he was stuck in this deteriorating body, and they more clearly stated that that's why he needed Rey. And I don't think you need to make Rey Palpatine either, but that's changing what's physically in it. That's the biggest one and the hardest to massage, because that's Palpatine coming back isn't inherently terrible, but I think if you were going to do that, you had to explain it better.
For sure.
The movie didn't even try.
No, it didn't. That's why in my mind, he could be, this is a clone, but not the original clone. It's kind of a not as good clone, so it would make a little more sense to me as to how he would be able to come back and not retain everything that Palpatine had before.
Yeah, a lot of 9 could have been about there were some cut scenes of Ben on Mustafar, I think, and part of that could have been contextualizing how Palpatine did that and how he's back. That could have been a really interesting kind of mystical mystery for the movie. It would also sort of recontextualize, them searching for the Death Star too, or what they were searching for with the Sith dagger. So that could have been really cool. There's just so many layers to Palpatine coming back and how it was handled that are the biggest issues with all 3 movies that it would take a lot to fix, because
I think especially because they didn't really plant any seeds in the first 2 movies of that being the case.
No, they didn't. They made Snoke what's called a strand cast. That's like a clone amalgamation of a bunch of different things. It's like a wholly unique genetic creation in a tube. It's pretty weird. If I were them, because they don't state it he just says I am Snoke in the movie, but that scene could have been expanded on. Some people think this is dumb. I think Snoke should have just been Darth Plagueis, and the vats that we see could have been trying to create a body for him or something, because maybe Palpatine needed
You
to
could have
learn
took the
something
same
from
story
him,
with
or,
Palpatine and just made it for Plagueis.
yeah, or just made it, yeah, there's a lot that they could have done there, and that one is the hardest to massage without just straight up changing the movie.
Yeah.
I think you can better explain Luke. You can explain why Anakin wasn't really involved. I mean, nothing's going to make the thematic and emotional weight of it undermining Anakin's sacrifice. There's nothing that you can really do to fix that at this point, because unless they want to release like a version of the movie where we physically see him. But I would have added in scenes of Anakin trying to reach out to Ben, and he can't because he's not receptive. He's just not interested in what Anakin has to say. He wants to know who Vader is. Kind of ties back into Ben also. Maybe one of the reasons he fell was he doesn't know why. He doesn't know that he doesn't know that Vader killed the Emperor in the end. So maybe it's presented to him by Snoke that Luke and everybody else betrayed Vader. We don't know the re-education that.
We know that Snoke was twisting his mind a lot, so we just don't know what was said to twist it.
Yeah, so I think for that to work, we just need to see more of that manipulation. We need to see what kinds of things he was saying to him. This is something the Clone Wars helped out with Anakin. I mean, we see Palpatine manipulating Anakin in the prequels, but it's nice to get more of that.
Yeah.
We see the Jedi sort of failing in the Clone Wars in a more obvious way. I think that was always the intent with the prequels, but the fact that people still argue about it online means there's at least some amount of ambiguity in whether or not the Jedi were intentionally daft, which they definitely were. Otherwise, the Clone Wars would not have gone that direction with Dave Filoni's reference of George Lucas and George Lucas's involvement in the show. But the fact that there's still an argument about it leads me to believe that it wasn't the most clear that it could have been, and I think something like that could be applied where we just get more information for Ben as well.
Yeah,
retcons are tricky, especially when
the fan base is deeply involved.
Yeah, and I would want to do this in such a way that it's not like stomping on the enjoyment that people have, but I can't imagine that they can make the justification for Palpatine coming back worse.
Yeah.
Barely know anything about why Ben fell, so they can't really make that worse. I mean, there are always going to be people that disagree. I mean, there are people that didn't like that Vader wasn't just power hungry and that's why he fell.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to it than that. To me, what they've came up with was a lot more interesting than the version of events that people made up in their heads in the 1990s. But
I thought it was pretty amazing.
But so there's going to be arguments either way, but I think that there's definitely massaging that we could do to make it fit better into the canon, because there's always this in the back of my head when I'm watching The Mandalorian and I'm loving it. I'm watching Kenobi or watching whatever show. I'm like, but Palpatine just comes back in some weird body and it's never explained, and then Rey gets the victory over Palpatine instead of Luke and Anakin, and
not explained yet.
It wasn't emotionally or thematically her fight to win. I think it would have been fine even if they presented a bigger threat than Palpatine that came from the unknown regions and she helped stop that. That would have been fine. It's not like a power level thing for me. It's not like, she can't stop Palpatine. It's not about that. It's about that. I think that was Anakin's victory to have. Yeah. And it feels like she was made a Palpatine in the movie to justify that decision rather than that being something that they really wanted to do.
Yeah, I would have to agree.
And this is a big problem with the way that JJ wrote 7, and it's something that got criticism at the time, but most people are like, but 7 was really fun, and I loved it when it first came out. But 9 kind of makes you see it in a new light. Still enjoyable to watch on its own, but you realize that he set up a lot of things in there and did not know what the answers to those questions would be.
Very clearly, or whatever he thought they were going to be was changed by someone else,
Right, and so Rey was a nobody in 8. I thought that was underwhelming as a reveal. However, that could have been expanded on in 9, and they could have had the same ending with her taking on the Skywalker name as sort of an adopted child. That could have been cool, and it's a good message to send to children who don't have parents or don't have their biological parents in their lives. And I think that's great. Yeah, so I think that's great, but making her a Palpatine was unnecessary. We can't really retcon that. Nope. That's just what it is. And it's because of that. It clearly, the filmmakers had different ideas of what the answers to those questions would be, and it sort of speaks to a broader problem with 8. I think where subversion is good, but I think if you're going to subvert the audience, you have to provide a more interesting answer. You can't just say these questions don't matter.
Agreed.
Without following it up with something more interesting, like who Snoke is, who Rey is, how did Ben fall. You can't just tell the audience, okay, these things kind of don't matter. We're breaking convention.
Clearly,
That's
I think
fine.
people think that they matter, considering the reception of people asking, "Yo, what the heck's up with these things?"
Yeah, 7 set it up to matter.
Yeah,
These were intended to be threads to be pulled on. They were written that way, and if you're going to subvert that, you have to then provide a more interesting answer. Like Vader and Anakin being the same person is more interesting than Vader being a separate student of Obi-Wan's that killed Anakin. Right? Like
Yeah.
that's far more interesting,
Yeah.
and that is a subversion of tropes. Like that created the trope of the twisted parrot, basically, or at least brought it to like
Yeah.
kind of a mainstream level. I'm sure it's come up in stories before that. That's not really something that can be fixed by the movie, but at least by retcons. But I'm hoping that with some of these recontextualizations that we've mentioned, explaining how Ben fell, providing further context to that, providing further context to Luke's characterization in 8 for why he got that cynical about Ben in the first place, when he was willing to die for his father, who had not shown through any actions that he was willing to be redeemed.
Yeah.
Like he just believed it into existence.
And it worked.
Palpatine, and then Anakin not appearing is, I think, more of a thematic
Misstep.
misstep, and also and a narrative misstep, because it doesn't really make sense. You can explain away most of it based on how we kind of understand Force Ghost to work now, but it doesn't really make sense why he didn't show up at the end, except for a disembodied voice. I think that if they were ever to re-release 9, I would add in further context. I would have Luke and Anakin taking a much more active role in helping Rey, and then of course with the retcons to how Palpatine came back in the first place.
Very good. I think that pretty much sums up everything that we had to retcon. So I think those could help a lot. Let me know, though, out there, what do you guys think? Is there any other retcons that you would like to see for the sequel trilogy? I'm Keegs. Ben has joined me. Say goodbye, Ben.
Goodbye. Oh, and one last thing. If you love
yes.
these movies as they are, that's totally fine. Just
Of
because
course,
we don't feel
always.
that way doesn't mean that we're objectively correct or anything, but that's how we feel and think would be better for
sure.
Star Wars long term.
And we both do love Star Wars in its entirety.
Yeah. Like we said, we don't want to get rid of their existence. We just want more there to help massage out those lore and thematic issues that we've discussed.
Perfect. Well, thanks for listening, everyone, and I will catch you all next time for some more Star Wars content.